Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeff O'Keefe. I know many of you. I'm the executive director of Zen Peacemakers. And you all know, of course, but you have joined a new series that we're doing. We just began a couple of months ago. We're calling this Fearless Hearts, Women in Leadership in Contemplative Social Action. And rather than having anyone have to guess, I'll just be transparent about what my subversive agenda is. I'm really hoping to, and we have done so, engage and enlist, women who have long careers in social action based in contemplation, and have accomplished much, to come and share with us, primarily so younger women can be inspired. Now, if we are an older man or a younger man or an older woman, it's quite all right to be inspired. It's okay. But my intention was very overt otherwise. We at Zen Peacemakers, we talk and think a lot about the future and about succession, if you will. I'm not sure that's the right word, but legacy or lineage, and trying to do a deliberate effort to pass these practices and these teachings along to those who come after. So, the 1,000-year plan, if you will. So that's what we're doing here today. I'm so delighted. Judith Simmer Brown will be our guest today. And many of you know Judith, or at least have heard of her. Judith is a teacher in the Tibetan tradition, a scholar. She was one of the founding faculty of Naropa University, which is here in Boulder, Colorado, enjoying its 50th anniversary this fall, which is quite an accomplishment. And really, congratulations to Naropa and to Judith for being part of that community for, what did you say, 45, 46 years, something like that. So Judith is going to share about her path, how she got engaged, and how she got to where she is today. So I thank you all once again for being here, and we will. Judith will tell you, but we're gonna break it up a little bit too, so you'll have a chance to interact. So if you have questions or ideas you want to bring up, you'll have a couple of chances to do that, I think. So, Judith, with that, I will pass you the invisible talking stick, and I will mute myself. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and delighted to be here as part of this series. It's, I believe, did you say that it was sponsored by the Frederick P. Lenz Foundation for American Buddhism?
Thank you for saying that. I did not, but it indeed is, yes.
Yes, and I wanted to be sure to mention them. I'm on the advisory board of the Lenz Foundation and was part of the group that made the decision to focus their funding on women's leadership this year. And as a result, it's brought a lot of programs and initiatives forward featuring women teachers and women leaders in American Buddhism. And I just wanted to acknowledge the Lenz Foundation for being not just willing, but excited about bringing forward women leaders in American Buddhism. So you may have noticed that this year there's an unusual number of programs featuring women leaders, and this is really the vision and the work of the Frederick P. Lenz Foundation. So I'm very happy to be with you today. I wanted to focus today on a discussion about spirituality and social engagement and how those two actually work in Buddhism, but particularly how they've worked for me in my own journey. This is an unusual talk for me to be sharing so much from my own personal journey of practice in Buddhism for I've been a Buddhist practitioner for 53 years, and that's a long time, and realized that through all of that, there's been a lot of evolution and change in my relating to the integration of spirituality and social engagement. So with your permission, I'm going to begin with a bit of a PowerPoint, and then we'll have a discussion about what I'm presenting. And then I'm going to go into my more personal journey, retrospective about how what I'm talking about reflects in my own personal journey. So let me go to my PowerPoint, and you can see that, I hope. And here we go.
It's good. We can see it. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I love this title, Fearless Hearts. My pleasure. I wanted to just look at the foundations of how spirituality and social engagement go together in Buddha Dharma. The sense that this is core to what we know of as the Bodhisattva path. And the whole view of bodhicitta, bodhicitta, which is the awakened heart, the heart of enlightenment that is so predominant in Mahayana Buddhism, has these two parts. Awakened, which refers to the absolute truth, or seeing the true nature of mind and of phenomena empty and luminous. So it's much more the wisdom side. And then on the other side is heart, which is, sorry, let me make sure. Are you still seeing this in full screen? No, you're not. Here we go.
There you go. Yeah.
There we go. All right. And the heart part is choiceless care and service for others, caring very much for how beings are in the world. And so it is much more the compassion side. So bodhicitta is this perfect marriage of wisdom and compassion that forms the foundation of the bodhisattva path. This is the view that is there in Buddhism that makes organizations like the Zen Peacemakers really have their kind of marching orders about what's involved in making a difference in the world. But what we often do in our society, probably in many societies, but especially in the West, is we often split out the wisdom, the absolute dimensions, and the relative dimensions. And we focus on one or the other, and we don't fully integrate these two. So one extreme is what we know of as spiritual bypassing. This is something that's talked about a lot at Naropa, but it's the way in which we use spirituality as a way to avoid facing unresolved personal issues. This is how it's classically defined. But in some of my own work, I also have seen that this is used to not relate to social justice issues in our world. And so I've done some writing about racism in American mindfulness and how we are involved so much in spiritual bypassing. We are not really looking at how racism is manifests in our American Buddhist communities. Spiritual bypassing is a tendency to focus on the absolute dimensions of the Bodhisattva path and ignore the relative dimensions of compassion and care for others. This is the caricature is when people are told that if they're having a lot going on, a lot of concern for the world, just to meditate more, and then everything will go away. The other extreme is something that I haven't heard others talk about, but I talk about this in my own teaching. I would call it social justice bypassing. That is, people who get stuck on the relative dimension and use a kind of social justice urgency to become overly distressed and to say that we aren't going to connect with the absolute because of their incredible sense of the world being on fire. There's so much intensity and urgency and panic involved that it means that this blurs our sense of perspective, our judgment, our personal priorities, and the ability to strategically engage. And so one finds this in American Buddhism these days in some of the social justice movements in American Buddhism, which are saying, don't meditate, just do something, just get involved and become part of social engagement. getting stuck in one extreme or the other is definitely a commonality in American Buddhism. It's been a commonality in my own life. And it's important to understand that for the Buddha, it's sitting in the fire in the midst of what's going on in our world that really makes it possible for us to be effective and to be of benefit in the world. So I wanted to uh, pause here and talk a little bit about the middle way of the importance of understanding that we can actually join the absolute and the relative in our world. We can join our practice and our action in our world, and that it's essential in these times that we do so, that we not turn away from suffering, but that we also bring suffering to our practice and to our cushions, to our practice. And this has especially been the focus of the Compassion Initiative at Naropa University that I started about 10 years ago, focusing on how it is that we can bring awareness of all of the incredible suffering of the world together and bring it directly into our practice and allow our compassion practice to bring our sane and caring hearts directly into social engagement so that we can be strategic and we cannot burn out. It's so easy if we do not actually understand the full integration of the absolute and the relative. It's so easy for us to burn out in our social justice engagement or to just tune out altogether and become couch potatoes. And so that's really important. I founded in 1995 the Engage Buddhism MA program at Naropa, and in the process of working with my colleagues on founding the Engage Buddhism program, I went to 3 different engaged Buddhists for advice about how to train people in this integration of the absolute and relative. And the 3 people who I went to were Sulak Shivaraksha of the International Network of Engaged Buddhism, who's a dear friend from Thailand. And I asked him this question. I also asked Arya Ratana from the Sarvodaya movement in Sri Lanka. And I asked Bernie Glassman, who founded Zen Peacemakers, how do we train engaged Buddhists? And each of them, unprompted, gave me exactly the same answer. They said, expose them to suffering. And this became the core of our curriculum in the Engaged Buddhism program at Naropa. Eventually, the Engaged Buddhism program evolved and morphed into the MDiv program. Our students wanted to end up with a credential where they could get a job in the world of social engagement. And so our Engaged Buddhism program in about 2001, 2002 became an MDiv program. So I would like to pause here for discussion and see what you think about these. First of all, the 3 themes. One is bodhicitta as the perfect marriage of the absolute and relative, bringing the wisdom of emptiness and luminosity together with the caring heart of compassion. And then the second, how it is we can split off of these and get stuck in spiritual bypassing on the one hand, or social justice bypassing on the other, which is a term that I've coined. I haven't heard anyone else use this, but I see this as one of the predominant themes in the socially engaged Buddhists of our times, the ones who feel like meditation is simply not important or necessary, that it's too urgent a time to waste our time in retreat. And then what it means to bring these together in training ourselves in engaged Buddhism by exposing ourselves to suffering. So what kind of responses do you have to this? Comments or observations from your own experience or questions you may have? I see Jacqueline has her hand up.
Yes, thank you so much, Judith. It's just a beautiful, clear, simple explanation of something that can feel very complex. And I certainly have fallen into both ruts. And what comes to mind for me is when I went to Burma a number of years ago, I saw there was this golden Buddha temple, and people were there. You walk up to the temple to get in, and there's all these people sitting in rows selling little trinkets, really, really poor people. And there was a mother and a son and selling a bracelet. And I bent down and I purchased the bracelet. And my host, who was a part of the Buddhist thing I was in, slapped my hand away. And I was shocked, and I got into the place where the golden Buddha was, and there was all this food that was put in front of this gold statue. And for me, that was a example of how spiritual bypassing manifests in the world as um, uh, honoring the vision of something rather than the real compassion.
Yes, that's a great vignette. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Wonderful. Allie, I see you have your hand up.
Hi there. I wanted to
Hi, nice to see you.
great to see you. I wanted to ask a question in reference to spiritual bypassing and the current war climate that we're dealing with. Of course, you and other folks on this call know that I'm an Iraq and Afghanistan war veteran, and I
Yes.
serve as a Buddhist chaplain on campus. And so spiritual bypassing has been called, if you're not advocating for or against the war, but maintaining a non-violent conflict, peaceful resolution type of attitude, but without picking who you're for or against, seems to be something that's being called a method of spiritual bypassing. Although
Mm.
people are holding like that separation of church and state and that middle ground, are called bypassers. What are your reflections on that?
My reflection is that that is a misunderstanding of spiritual bypassing because for me, the core of the Bodhisattva path is not to vilify any person because as we take the Bodhisattva vow, we vow to care for all beings, even those who others may hate. And the whole notion of siding in these kinds of protest environments is so often accompanied by vilifying the other, people who we disagree with. And as Bodhisattva, as in my understanding, it means holding others deeply in our hearts, being willing to be in the messy middle, being willing to not take those kinds of sides, even though there may be principles or behaviors or policies that we disagree with tremendously, never to confuse that with beings. Because when we start vilifying beings, it's a violation of our bodhisattva vow. The fundamental goodness at the core of even the most hated people, the core of Tonglen practice is to hold the being who is so hated in your heart and hold their goodness and encourage their goodness to come forward in ways that are not harmful or violent toward others. So I think it takes a lot of courage these days to be a Buddhist in the midst of those kind of protest situations and separate out behaviors, policies, activities from people themselves. And I think it's a very rough thing, but at least that's the way I've been taught. That's the way we teach our students at Naropa. And of course, lots of times that is the hardest thing in the world, but that's where contemplative practice comes in, where we can contemplate the humanity at the core of even the most uh, intensely despotic person and see that humanity and goodness at the heart. Does that answer your question? And how is that for you, Allie?
Yes, I'm so grateful. I think there definitely needs to be some more literature about spiritual bypassing, and then working on in campus and campus environments with young people who are actively engaged in activism and very, very passionate about these sorts of things. It's really helpful to have this perspective. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And yes, my years at Naropa, this has been a conversation every single year. Even though I'm retired from full-time teaching, I'm still involved with students who are for or against. And there haven't been demonstrations at Naropa, but then there's been very intense back and forth situations. So I know that your situation at Brown is a little more out on the green, active student demonstrations. So thank you. Thank you so much for bringing that question forward.
If
Anything else at this point?
it, Paula has her hand up there.
Yes, Paula. Hi,
And,
Paula.
and
Lovely to see you.
Judith, may I say, for the others who are off screen and we can't see them, you can use your electronic hand down under reactions if your screen is turned off. Thank you.
Good morning, Judith. Thank you. I appreciated hearing your, as others have said, your very clear explication of something very complicated. And this is something you've probably hear, many of you have heard, at a chaplaincy conference held at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in March. Gil Fronsdale's description of a chaplain was offered, and it was fabulous. That, how firefighters run to the fire. Well, chaplains run to the suffering.
That's right.
And I was teaching a course on ritual. These are students who want to be chaplains, very engaged with the world and trying to find that middle ground. And I have one student who works with the New York Police Department. And I just wanted to share the final assignment of the class was come up with a ritual. And so he came up with one that I thought was so brilliant, inspired by the Catholics signing the cross, that there are first responders who, before they jump out, they do signing of the cross. And so that gets them back to their core values. And it's very hard not to become cynical and bitter, because it's like no matter how hard they work, bad things keep happening. And so as a Buddhist chaplain, not on the payroll yet, but New York Police Department is working on that. They have a Muslim now. So he came up with kind of a mudra. He doesn't use any Buddhist words, that he thought maybe first responders can do before they jump out of a car, or in response to, when he gave an example which inspired him, a police officer getting a call. And clearly he's not on site. He's talking to the person, and there is some bad injury on the other end. He wouldn't go into details. He did say the person survived, but it so rattled the police officer that there was nothing he could do. And he was just rattled. And it was not a culture where you could just reach over and hug him. But it was clear his nervous system just needed calming down, and a hug could do that, but that was not the culture. So part of the ritual he designed is a little more elaborate than I'll share now. But first, doing the gasho, he just says it's unity. And then on the New York Police Department badge, there are not one, but two eagles on it. And so that kind of very powerful image. So from going to a gasho, where that calms the nervous system, because you're making the full circuit. And then he didn't know it was a thing, but it turns out it is. He made an eagle that lands on his chest. And so having the eagle land on your chest is like giving a self hug. And then keeping your fingers from not separating, make a lotus. And he has to teach them about, that this healing, the beauty arises out of the mud, and then just back to the unity. And so he's getting this out in the New York Police Department, in first responders, EMTs. And I just think, wow, I hope this takes off.
That's
That
beautiful.
those on the front line, the Buddhist tradition, not that we have to settle on one thing, but even if you're not Buddhist, that you have something physical to do to bring you to your embodied care. Anyways, I
That's
just wanted to
wonderful. Thank you so much, Paula. That's a great example. And I do agree that that chaplains are those that run toward the suffering. So
Yeah.
thank you. So Ella, this will be our last question before I continue my presentation. Ella, so nice to see
Oh,
you.
nice to see you, Judith. Yeah, I hope it's not going to be too provocative, but like I'm Ukrainian, and I have some Buddhist friends who volunteer to go to war, and they hate Russians right now.
Yes.
They need to kill
Yes.
them.
And I've met some of these people and have been to your Ukrainian meditation group. So we've had some really provocative discussions.
Yeah, and it just for me, it's a little different idea of bypassing. Like if I tell them, no, you need to see their basic goodness, in this moment feels like spiritual bypassing. So for me, it's just let them feel what they feel and respect
Yes.
that.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think that there are those stories from the battlefield where soldiers on the opposite side have this moment of recognition of that they're in this terrible situation together, and yet it's warfare, and it's you can't dictate to someone that, oh, you should, but the invitation to understand the difference between people's basic humanity and the circumstances in which they find themselves. uh, the soldiers on the battlefield are not those that made the decisions for them to be there. And having had quite a few veteran students who've shared their experience of being on the battlefield, of not really they put themselves there, but they were not the ones who sent them to war. So this is it's a very, very tough thing. I really appreciate, Ella, that you will be a presenter later in this series, and I definitely am going to show up for the conversation when you're leading the session. Thanks so much today. Okay, so I wanted to go a little further with my presentation and talk about my own personal journey. I've had an interesting time thinking back over the years of involvement in spirituality and social engagement, and finding that I go back to some categories I learned from a book by Ken Jones called The Social Face of Buddhism. It's a book that we used as a textbook at the time when we opened our Engage Buddhism MA program, and I went back and looked at it again. Ken Jones has a really interesting definition of social engagement. And I tend to use the word social engagement rather than social justice, because justice has such a charged good and bad polarizing impact, the word justice. And I've learned that even in the legal world, there's not a clear sense of right and wrong. It's more pragmatic than that. But social justice warriors can often develop incredible moral indignation about right and wrong that can add a tremendous amount of hatred to their work. So social engagement is the terminology we've used a great deal at Naropa, finding that that is really applies to a broad range of ways that we engage in compassionate activity for the world. And Ken Jones has a definition of this that I wanted to share with you when he talks about three kinds of social engagement. He defines it as social and political activism, which is the kind of thing that Ali's talking about, the campus demonstrations, the variety of ways that people are demonstrating or out in the trenches of social engagement in activism forms. The second one he talks about is service professions or service volunteer activities of working in at a homeless shelter, in a soup kitchen, working at the border, helping immigrants who have come across the border. There are lots of categories of this. Even becoming a psychologist, or I see that my work at Naropa is a kind of service as well. It's service professions and service volunteer activities. And the third one he talks about is building enlightened communities. That is, building some kind of perhaps alternative community within the larger, more difficult world that we're in, but building communities from the inside out. I added a fourth one here, which is really what I think of as integrating these. So as we talk further, and I'm going to talk about my own personal journey, which has zigzagged between these different categories, including category 4, of finding what kind of form of social engagement is most, where do you find your heart most? Where do you find your activity most? Are you in more than one of these? And we'll have a discussion about that. But at this point, I'm going to talk more about my own personal journey. My father was a Methodist minister who came through seminary training in the 40s when Christian seminaries, Protestant seminaries, were very caught up in the work of Reinhold Niebuhr. And Reinhold Niebuhr, the Christian theologian, talked about that institutions are inherently corrupt, and that the work of ministry was to dismantle institutions, which was always sort of a kind of contradiction when you find yourself in the midst of an institution. But my father was a classic person who separated out social engagement and spirituality. He had tremendous spiritual curiosity himself, but he was incredibly angry in a social justice way. And he never in his long life was able to marry these two. They were always at odds. And so I've inherited that from him. But when I was in college, I went on a study abroad program to India. And here are some photos of my time in India. Are you able to see all 4 of these photos? Just making sure.
Yes, Judith, they're good. They're good.
Okay, good. These are blurry photos, but I went to a Gandhian ashram college in Ahmedabad, India for a semester when I was 19 years old. I was given a spinning wheel. You see my spinning wheel in the upper right, and studied Mahatma Gandhi and his philosophy, his social activism, his vision for social change in India. And the school that I attended was based on these principles. It was fascinating. From the first day, I was given this spinning wheel, and the students at the Gujarat Vidyapit were expected to, by the time they graduated, to have produced themselves by hand all the cloth needs in their life, all their clothing, their sheets, their blankets, their towels, every piece of cloth that they used in their life had to have been made by them by hand spun, hand woven. And so this was an incredible experience. It also involved working in the cotton fields, picking cotton. It involved going out to the villages and building roads and digging wells. And it was an incredibly powerful example of a completely integrated model of social engagement that included activism, because the Gandhians were still doing demonstrations in India, service, and building an enlightened community. So my semester in India as a college junior had a tremendous effect on my life and made me develop some real understanding that it's possible to fully integrate spirituality and social engagement. The picture on the lower left is the assembly hall at Gujarat Vidyapit with a huge cutout of Gandhi in front, and everyone who's sitting there is spinning. We had to spin 2 to 3 hours a day to produce the quota of thread needed in order to produce as much cloth as we would need by the time the students graduated. I was not a good spinner. I would have been threadbare. I would have been wearing skimpy clothing by graduation if I'd stayed there for my whole education. But it was incredibly inspiring to be part of a community that had so thoroughly integrated spirituality and social engagement. This became a tremendous inspiration for me. I came back from India, went to grad school first at Florida State University and then at Columbia University in South Asian religion. And along the way, definitely got exposed to feminism and became very, I of course had been involved with anti-war protests. This was in the late 60s. So I was very involved in anti-war protests. Lots of my friends from college were drafted. Some were killed in Vietnam. Many were changed in Vietnam. My brother was kicked out of college for demonstrating against the war. This is sort of the activism side of my life. And oops, let's see what's happening here. There we go. But around that time, I first met Suzuki Roshi and became a Zen student in 1971 while I was still at Columbia University. And I got my first teaching job and shortly thereafter became exposed to Tibetan Buddhism. Suzuki Roshi died only a year after I met him. And then I met Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche the first summer of Naropa and began practicing in the Tibetan tradition. So this became really core in my life. But as I got involved in my first teaching job, I became very active as a feminist and was president of the National Organization of Women in Washington State, the regional president of National Organization for Women, became very involved in the anti-rape movement. And I also was recruited by the Human Rights Commission of the state of Washington for a class action suit against Western Washington University for terminating my contract. I was not in a tenure track contract, but I was in an instructor position. But I was the first woman that my department had ever hired. They terminated my contract and hired a man in my place. And the Human Rights Commission made me part of a class action suit against the university that was definitely a radicalizing experience. So these are photos from that time in my life. As the lower left, I was the director of Rape Relief, a rape crisis center that I directed for 3 years and taught part-time during that time after my termination from Western, and then eventually won the discrimination suit against the university. And the university was forced to offer me the next job that came open for which I was qualified, even while privately telling me that if I came back to the university, they'd make up my life a living hell. So it was around that time I was offered a job at Naropa. So the trenches of feminism were rough. During my years of running a rape crisis center, I worked with rapists in prison as well, doing an experiment in confrontation of rapists, and finding in my so-called confrontation of rapists in prison that I could not not see their humanity and the mess of their lives, even while I held them responsible for the harm they had done to victims who I knew. So this messy middle situation really began to emerge in my life around the time that I went to Naropa as a faculty member. the first year I was at Naropa, I sat a month-long datun at what came to be known as Shambhala Mountain Center. At that time, it was Rocky Mountain Dharma Center, very muddy place. One of the early datuns or monthly sittings. You'll see right here Pema Chodron, who is the director of the datun. This is when I became quite close to her as my meditation instructor, and I am right here with my Datuni friends. So zigzagging between social engagement and spirituality. This was the story of my life during these years. This was the summer or the fall of 1978. So in my years of teaching at Naropa, I began to understand something about service and education as service. And so these are the years when I began to move from activism per se into understanding social engagement as service. And so I taught full-time at Naropa for 43 years. Now it's been 47 years. I'm still on contract at Naropa, but no longer full-time. And this is a time when we, founding faculty at Naropa and in the years since, began to see ourselves training people in bodhisattva activity of service in the world. So our degree programs, as they developed, were all about helping our students find ways of entering a world of service as activists in the environmental studies program, as artists, in writing and poetics and in performing arts, in psychology, becoming therapists, becoming chaplains. And so I was one of the founders of our chaplaincy program that became an evolution from the Engaged Buddhism program. So this was a period of my life when I really began to understand more the service aspects of the Bodhisattva path. And yet I also was constantly involved with practice and retreats in a variety of settings as I became more deeply a student of Shambhala. And as an acharya, a senior teacher in Shambhala, one of the things that was really meaningful to me is that our teacher, Sakyong Mipam Rinpoche, each year asked the acharyas to renew our vows. And our vows, when we renewed our vows, we had to say what we were doing in our personal practice, what we're doing for the community, the Shambhala community, and what we're doing for the world. So each year we formulated our commitment for the coming year, which really highlighted how Shambhala had at its core a social engagement commitment of building enlightened society and service coming from the Bodhisattva path. So that has been an incredibly important part for me. Of course, Shambhala has been through incredibly difficult times in the years since, and yet I take to heart this commitment that this is really the core of what it means to be a Bodhisattva. What are you doing in your personal practice? What are you doing for your spiritual community? What are you doing for the world? And then to go on just a little bit about how social engagement still is an important part in the activism side. Practice, this is in our center of the Shambhala Center in Mexico, Casa Huerma, leading retreats in Mexico. In the upper right is my holding the wind horse, which is the symbol of egoless inspiration, of energy, of care for the world. The Women of Wisdom Summit and other activities bringing women's leadership forward. This is an ongoing commitment of mine for American Buddhism. And in the lower right, this is the Shambhala group that joined the first Buddhist delegation to the White House in 2014. there was a large gathering of Buddhists who went to the White House, particularly around the issues of climate change and racism. And I was part of the racism group. Here we are holding the banner in front of the White House about the karma of slavery is heavy. So key Buddhist leaders from around the country came to talk about what we as a community could contribute to a solution around racism. Again, this was 2014. Obama was still president at that point, and lots of things changed after the election in 2016. So anyway, this has led me to reflect on how I began with the image in the Gandhian Ashram College of an integrated social engagement model, which so fully integrated social justice issues with spirituality, and then zigzagged back and forth throughout my life. The Shambhala vision is very much connected and based on the Shambhala Dharma of my root teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, of that the basic goodness of all beings is at the core of all of our social engagement. That's why we're engaged, is to uplift and highlight the basic goodness of every human being. And building some kind of enlightened community or society is core to bringing out the basic goodness of all. And that still is at the heart of my commitment in my practice and in my activity in the world. So I'd like to just open it to discussion, but I'd like to do it in the form of asking the question of all of you: how are you integrating social justice concerns and spirituality in your own life? And what form is it taking in terms of these three areas of activism, service, and building enlightened or sane or equitable societies? I'm curious what you would have to say about that. And we could have a discussion about that, and it can go any direction you like. I'm wondering, I wonder if I could be put on gallery for this.
Oh, wait, I think you just turned the spotlight off and then maybe you should go.
There we go. Great. For some reason, my ability to go to gallery myself got lost there. So wonderful. So I can see you all. I'm wondering what you would like to bring forward in terms of your own reflections. And I see Eva has her hand raised. Please, Eva.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Good, thank you. So I'm very interested in something more defined, like listening within social justice and spirituality.
Could you
Like-
say that again? Listening?
Listening, yeah, how we
Yeah.
listen to each other,
Oh, that's so
how we
important.
listen. I'm part of the initiative called I Love to Listen Day with Mavash and McIntosh, which is on 16th of May each year. It's an International I Love to Listen Day. And so we think a lot about how we listen. And when I thought about, and I'm also Ukrainian, and so what I thought about listening in this way is that the role of actual lived experience. If it comes, let's say, to racism, if it comes to being on the battlefield and fighting for Ukraine against occupation, I realized how important it is to actually listen to people who are there. Because it's so different. It's so different for each of us. So I'm Ukrainian, but I'm not a soldier on the battlefield. So I'm not the one actually putting my life on the line to protect other lives against occupants. So it is easier for me to see basic goodness in everyone because I'm not preparing myself to give my life or my health to protect others. and I'm not exposed to this amount of violence.
Yes.
I'm also white, for example.
Yeah.
I'm not exposed to the same amount of racism as a person of color.
Yeah.
So there are so many things where I think it can be way too fast and way too easy to introduce this middle ground or this opposition of hatred or opposition of the desire for social justice in its hateful and the most rageous form. It is easy when one doesn't have the lived experience and is not in the middle of it and is not the direct victim of it.
Yes.
And so I think that, sure, if someone wants to have empathy with a Russian soldier who has killed and raped women in Ukraine and children, you know, and done horrible thing in Bucha, for example, if someone wants to empathize with them, maybe they can do it, but not, in my opinion, not in front of a Ukrainian person who is in the middle of it, because
Yes.
this is just insulting. If someone wants to emphasize with a racist, then they should not do it in front of, let's say, a Black person who is been a victim of racism.
Yeah.
Because this in itself, this noble, in a way, middle ground, which I would say is the maybe comes from the wisdom point of absolute wisdom. For me, it violates the relative dimension, and I see myself as a bystander and as an enabler if I allow people saying even those type of things in front of a victim in the middle of the mass. So so for me, it's about listening and about spaces and being aware and mindful about who is in the room, how the boundaries of a space are defined. So yeah, that's what I just wanted to share.
That's very helpful, Eva. And I hear 2 points there that I think need to be brought forth. The listening dimension is so important. And one of the areas of engagement that I value so much in my life is interreligious dialogue, where I'm involved in dialogue with religious others, some of whom have been hateful in their speech about other religious communities, and how difficult it is to be in those kind of situations. But I also really appreciate what you're saying is it's easy to be an armchair engaged Buddhist who is not in those very difficult situations where there is such pain and such violence and such intensity that it's very difficult to be in some kind of in the middle situation. And the thing that I can remember the most in my own experience is being asked to go into a prison, a rapist prison in Seattle, and confront the rapist who I was part of the trial that put him in prison as an advocate for a Native American woman who had been raped by him, and being in prison and asked to confront him with his crime, which he denied. It was such a difficult situation. And I have to say that all of my bodhisattva principles sort of went out the window at that point. I had such a difficult time and found myself really affected deeply, knowing the incredible harm and violence and injury he had caused this woman, who I accompanied to court and was asked to also testify against him. It was a situation I should not have been in a prison environment, and very, very tough. So yeah, easy to keep it kind of neat and clean when we don't find ourselves in the middle of those kind of situations. Thank you so much for your wisdom on this. And I do think that listening is key. It has been an incredibly important part of my experience in dialogue as well. So I see Mary.
Hi, Judith.
Hi, nice to see you.
Good to see you too. For me, what is incredibly helpful in terms of holding compassionate view is also holding a trauma-informed view,
Yes,
which allows for a deeper understanding that the actions that one is taking out in life are being driven by. If it's a painful action, it's driven by a painful feeling or painful wound, which is still active and alive in that person's being. And I started to play around with this concept too of being trauma informed as a synonymous parallel with being dharma informed, that all the causes and conditions have created this moment just as it is. And this can be characterized on an individual level. It can be characterized on a collective level. It can be characterized on the level of nations. So that really helps me stay out of kind of a binary view and open up to a more compassionate view.
Can you say a little more, Mary, about what would characterize a trauma-informed view?
So, for example, so I work at a hospital, and if there's someone who is, let's say, speaking violently to the nurse or to the clinical team, instead of going into a more binary response where there might be blame or judgment, there's the practice of taking a pause and entering into a more open-ended, not knowing space to begin to understand what is the pain that's being activated in this person
Yes,
that is coming through their actions.
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
What are
beautiful.
they carrying, essentially? What are they carrying? Yeah.
Yes. Yes, and that is a way, a more precise way of talking about the difference between someone's actions and their humanity.
Yes.
Very helpful. And I know that you teach this at Upaya, and just really happy to see you bring that forward today, Mary.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
What else? What else is in the room? Allie, could I ask you a question?
Sure, of course.
Yes, I wanted to ask, in terms of what Mary was just bringing forward as trauma-informed, for you as a military veteran, disabled military veteran who've seen combat and also very deeply a bodhisattva, I wonder if you could share anything from your own experience about working with this kind of thing in your own life.
Well, just thank you for asking. Many of us have deep wounds, right?
Yeah.
And I think the trauma-informed care is a great way to engage ourselves in providing care through a lens of many of us are hurting, right? From my experience, it was encountering Buddhist teachings and a teacher who said it's okay to grieve. It's okay to feel what you need to feel.
Yeah.
To continue to work with your contemplative practice on the cushion while you do it. And so I guess in many ways, a teacher gave me permission and I listened. I felt like I was deeply heard and deeply seen and deeply validated through spiritual counseling and consultation. And that person did receive trauma-informed care. And I felt safe enough to talk about my experiences and the gift of permission, you know. So
Yes, that's very, very, very helpful. I thought about another experience that I had some years ago, going to a prison in southern Colorado. I've done refuge and bodhisattva vows in prisons quite a bit, And I went with the Ratna Peace Fellowship prison project to give vows in a couple of prisons in southern Colorado a few years ago. And the people who had set up these vows didn't tell me about the prisons that I went to, but I went to a prison to give refuge vows. And it turns out I didn't know until I was there that it was a sex offenders prison. Everybody there was a sex offender. And as somebody who'd worked a lot with rape victims, myself as a rape victim, to be finding myself without any kind of preparation, giving vows in a sex offenders prison was a very challenging experience for me. There were 8 people who wanted to take refuge. Part of taking refuge was my meeting with each of them individually, one-on-one, to ask them why they wanted to take refuge and to give them a refuge name, and then to preside over the ceremony of refuge for them in the prison. And this was one of those situations where my own trauma came out when I was sitting privately with rapists who began to ask me personal questions about myself, including someone who was about to leave prison, was about to be released, and knew my name and knew where I lived and wanted to look me up after leaving prison. I was completely seized with just complete panic and began to shake and began to feel personally threatened. And in some ways, that was part of the dynamic that was going on in that particular situation. But as I gave the refuge vows and gave the precepts to those taking the vows, and found myself during the ceremony weeping and weeping, and several of the men there also began to weep. And as I went through giving them the vows of refuge, I wept and they wept, and there was some, not all of them wept, some of them were not weeping, but the feeling of being able to go through with this while I was in a situation of feeling incredibly triggered myself was one of those really challenging situations about how to fulfill my bodhisattva vow in that kind of situation. It was hard. And yes, I was definitely experiencing my own trauma in that kind of situation. So that experience has stayed with me in the years since. I haven't been back to that particular prison. I haven't been invited back, but I also would have to prepare myself before going back to that particular prison. What else is coming out in the room? Yes, Eva.
Thank you. I apologize that it's again me.
No, don't apologize.
But
We want to hear more from you.
thank you, Judith. So what came to mind when you were reporting about the prison, and the rapists in the prison? What came to mind for me is how timeline matters.
Yes.
Where on the timeline we meet those who did something? Do we meet them in a timeline where they have abandoned their behavior and maybe shown regret? Or do we meet them in a timeline where they are determined to continue what they're doing? So in my case, since the war in Ukraine is ongoing right now, for example, having compassion it is a different, it's a totally different thing with having compassion with a Russian soldier who has regretted going there, has stopped occupying Ukraine, has shown clear regret, and now wants to go a totally different way. I have no problem having empathy for this person. However, it is very different to have empathy for someone who is fully determined to continue killing people in Ukraine, bombing our cities,
Yes.
taking away our freedom. You know, this is very different. Well, I can hold that they have some basic goodness inside. I want to not hurry up with that, and I can see how someone who is in the middle of trying to kill them so they cannot kill the other people, while they're preparing to really kill the killer, basically, how it is a very different thing that it is for me on my armchair. So just want to bring this dimension of a timeline. Where are they on the path right now? Thank you.
Yes, that's such an important point. And at least my experience with rapists in prison is that not all of them regret or admit or are changing their lifestyle. Of course, there are some who are, but the hot situation of the battlefield is there's no respite, there's no protection. At least in a prison environment, there is some protection involved. I just simply can't imagine it, not having been in that particular kind of environment. And I so appreciate your bringing that forward. And I know that when Ella is speaking in August, she's going to be talking more about the practice with our Ukrainian Sangha members and Ukrainian soldiers who are practitioners as well, struggling with the challenge of keeping the sense of bodhisattva vow while being engaged in such terrible warfare situations. So I want to go back to listening, Eva. How listening has influenced you on your path as a practitioner?
Yeah, so thank you for asking this. So listening, I most of all, I starting to realize my limits and the limits of other listeners. That listening goes way beyond two people sitting next to each other and one person being silent while the other person is speaking. Because there are so many other dimensions to it. Who is with whom is very important.
Yes.
Is the person who is listening having the same lived experience or not? What are incentives? Is this person has incentive to dismiss what the other person is saying? Will they benefit from dismissing and moving on too fast? And what are the consequences for the person speaking? I believe that everyone deserves to be listened to, but I don't believe that everyone deserves to be listened to by everyone. What I mean by that I don't believe that someone who has done harm to someone is entitled to be heard by the person they have harmed.
Yeah.
However, I believe that they should be listened by someone who has distance to that, a different type of person. And I think that on the other hand, in times when it comes to how much space who gets when, in terms of disinformation and all those things, and propaganda and all of whatever, how you call it, so who gets the forum, who gets the platform, it's also not irrelevant. So if I tell someone I'm listening to someone who is still harming you, I'm spending time, I'm giving them this. It can sound like I'm giving them permission to continue. So maybe it is better to remove myself from this. Maybe if I'm working with the victims, I should not be working with the perpetrators at the same time and let the victims know. And by the way, I'm also having as much compassion for them as for you. This in itself, while true on an absolute level, on a relative level, it is painful, insulting, and can be re-traumatizing.
Yes.
So this is the listening for me became something more for who listens, where, how long, why, for what reasons, going really deep into our own kind of what could it be? Is there anything I don't know about myself, which can be unconsciously guiding my desire to listen, which I would rather not want it to be guiding it? Is it some sort of self-serving benefit? So all of these very deep dimensions, I found that plays such a big role. And I can learn spiritually so much about myself by observing how I listen and
Yeah.
how others listen to me, or observing other people doing listening. Because this is where the selfishness, or whatever you call it, ego, or, it is plays such a huge role. But beyond that, the systemic issues, I think putting the listening process into systemic view of life, the interconnectedness, this is something, this is how I do it through with the listening, and very important for me to know when I'm not the right person to listen, and to just say, you know what, I might be just not the right person to be a listener here. I don't have what it takes to provide a safe space for those who want to speak in certain situations, certain contexts. So just know my limits. I think that became helpful. Thank you.
Yes, that's all so powerful. And certainly deep listening as a practice is a whole practice where there's some ground of mutuality, but it's very difficult to listen if there's no ground of mutuality at all, in part because of one's personal trauma. When I was part of the feminist anti-rape movement back in the 70s, there was very little understanding of many of these things. And so as a director of a rape crisis center funded by the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, but the vision behind it was very much feminist. There were a lot of experiments. So they came up with this idea of sending rape victim advocates into prison to confront rapists with their crimes, because rapists in prison were so universal in denying their crimes. And to be put in a situation where my job wasn't to listen, but to confront, incredibly difficult and uninformed. There's so many reasons why that was such a bad idea. And being a guinea pig in that situation was terrible and was traumatizing for me. So when I had this experience doing refuge vows in the prison, and the rapists began to describe their crimes to me, and one with great relish, somebody who had killed his victim, that triggered something in me that was so deep, connecting with the previous experience in prison decades earlier. That was not a good idea, to be a refuge preceptor in a situation where I wasn't prepared to really be the preceptor in that situation. So I really appreciate your sharing your experience, Eva, about listening, because you're right. There are situations we should be very careful not to put ourselves in. And we have our own trauma that we haven't healed and haven't worked with sufficiently to be of help to others. So
Thank you, Judith. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that it was actually also traumatizing and unpleasant for you. I think it's so important for me, and I think maybe for others to hear that just because something somehow worked out, it doesn't mean it it was not wrong in some way.
Yes.
And I think it's just, not only myself, but also when I facilitate groups, whom do I put together with whom? Because I can indirectly force someone to listen to something which is traumatizing to them. And so just being aware of the constellation, who is with whom, and create spaces which are mindful about this. I think that, so I see like how is it to send a woman, a young woman who is a rape survivor, into the rapist prison to help the rapist. I think I would say not do this
Not a
until
good
there is
idea.
not a good idea, even if it's like very noble from the Dharma thing or whatever. But I think knowing the limits and say like, hey, Dharma is very important. However, the relative safety in the moment, and for me, it's just respect and dignity for the people, is to not expose them to something they should not be exposed to at that moment. I think that's all. That's all from me. Thank you. I see there is also Shannon wanting to say something.
Yeah, thank you, Eva. Shannon, yes, please join the conversation.
Hi, Judith. Nice
Hi,
to see
Shannon.
you.
Nice to see you.
I think what Eva's speaking about, has been speaking about, really resonates. And I think what Eva was just getting at is something that I've come to terms with in terms of the importance of discernment and wisdom, in being able to determine what the best action is.
Yes.
I go to Naropa, and I'm in the contemplative program, not the MDiv program. But I often sometimes struggle when teachers talk about holding compassion for all peoples, when a lot of these teachers come from a certain background and
Right.
haven't had the lived experiences of a person of color, or being part of the queer community, or so on and so forth. And so it's really tricky, it's nuanced. And I think sometimes I interpret a lot as passivity, as the whole armchair thing. And so
Yes.
I guess my question to you is like, how do you personally determine the balance of like, am I armchairing right now? Or am I holding everything? And when do I go back in? Like, I view it as like an infinity loop. Like, we come back to the cushion so that we don't perpetuate what we're trying to dismantle. And then we go back out in the world, and then we come back. And that's how I've conceptualized it. But I'm just wondering what thoughts you have about that.
I really appreciate your bringing that forward, because I think it's the responsibility of anyone who has taken the Bodhisattva vow to commit to really discerning for oneself. To what extent are you rationalizing everything, and to what extent are you actually doing the work? And I do appreciate the advice given me by the engaged Buddhists back in the 90s about, leaning into suffering. And I think one thing is to identify what you may be using to cushion yourself from suffering is sort of smelly at times. If it becomes a way to be more comfortable and to be an armchair person, to really allow the vulnerability that comes from not knowing and from feeling the suffering directly and letting it wake you up. I think that's such an important part. And in our world full of racism and homophobia, etc., there's plenty of suffering around for us to lean into and to really develop true empathy. So again, I think that what Eva's been talking about, what Ali was talking about earlier as well, about the importance of feeling the feelings and of taking care of yourself along the way, making sure that you understand that there are situations that are going to be extremely difficult for you, but at the same time, to be willing to expose yourself to suffering and to lean into it in your practice. I think that's where practice is so powerful for dismantling self-deception. The Vidyadhara Trungpa Rinpoche always talked about the importance of dismantling our self-deception and that's an ongoing, constant process because we can hide behind personas and theories and rationalizations and really miss the suffering of our world. So how does that land with you, Shannon?
Yeah, no, good. I guess I'm just thinking in terms of it's tricky, you know. I've been really called to do things regarding what's happening in Gaza, and sometimes I feel like, oh, I've kind of like just distracted myself and I haven't really been feeling or doing anything because I kind of needed a break. And like, of course, we need to take care of ourselves, but at what point is it easy because I don't belong to either community for me to just with my privilege be able to just sit back and just say, well, you know, I have other things to do. Like I think I contend with that guilt a lot.
Yes, yes. And I think that's something that is living with the open question is a very important part of this. And being willing to keep it as an open question, to challenge yourself, to dismantle the self-deception of wherever you're at with things.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you so much for being here today. Yes, Jacqueline?
Yes. Oh, okay. Um, I missed a lot because my electricity went off. I'm going to have
Oh,
to go over it again to hear. But one of the things I struggle with is that there is so much suffering and so many places um, to put my energy, you know, in that I get overwhelmed about where to best put my energy because, you know, there's the political thing, which is very important, and they're coming at you and asking for help and money and this and that all the time. And I want to support, but then it gets like, okay, you know, and then I kind of zone out.
yes.
And that's true with a lot of other places of suffering. And sometimes the situation's so complex that I really have difficulty forming, you know, how best to support it. Like the Gaza thing, I'm really aware of how complex that situation is. And it's not easy enough for me to go protest because there's so many sides to it that don't make it an easy decision. So I don't know, could you say anything about the overwhelming need, the overwhelming suffering, being aware of it and finding your place in that?
Oh, that's such an important discernment for all of us, I think. Um, I know for myself, I feel that if we try to do everything, we do nothing. If we try to, you know, just sort of spread ourselves thin. So I found it very helpful when every year I was asked to renew my vow as an acharya and be strategic about what I was committing to for a year. I have found that helpful in my own life to sort of take a time, and this is Tibetan New Year when I do it, where I'm thinking about what I'm committing myself to for the next year, to think strategically about what I personally could be most helpful doing. That doesn't mean I don't do anything else, but where I focus my energies. And I think that's at least been for me very helpful for feeling less overwhelmed and helpless and spread thin, and and also to sort of up my priorities about whatever is the most currently important thing to focus on. Um, at least that's been my experience, just to feel a bit more empowered about the things that I am engaged with. And it's been important to me to be involved with education because it has such ramifications for future generations and other, you know, younger students and that kind of thing. But now that I'm retired and I have less contact with students, I'm having to rethink my priorities and where I put my energy. So I think this is an important way to focus one's attention as we go forward. we are near the end of our time. I'm wondering if there's any comments or observations that, particularly for people who haven't spoken so far, before we come to the end of our time, which is 4 minutes away, I believe. Is that right, Jeff? Yes.
That's correct. Yes.
I appreciate that this conversation has been real and tough and shows how challenging these topics are. It's very moving to have conversations like this. Yes, Alpa.
Hi, just wanted to appreciate everyone for being open and real about their experiences, and in particular, Ava, for helping me think about positionality in time and space, and the absolute right thing and the relative right thing, and to try to hold all that as I process everything that's going on. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you so much. I ditto, I second that. Thank you so much, Alpa. Yeah, it takes a lot of bravery to show up and share, particularly if we don't see things the same way. It's also a very powerful thing. So I appreciate your skillfulness, Ava, in bringing forward some controversial topics. Very important for us to hear, and feel tremendous gratitude toward you. And to everyone who spoke today, thank you so much. So I believe this is the end of our time, and what I would really like for us to do is to take a moment, in whatever way we wish, to find a way to dedicate the merit of our time together for the benefit of all, and especially those in specific suffering situations that we feel very connected with, but also more broadly as well, that whatever has opened our hearts further today and opened our minds further today could have some impact beyond this hour and a half together and benefit a wider world. So if we could silently together do our own dedications of merit. May this help overcome the adversity and estrangement, violence and alienation in the world, the greed, hatred, and delusion in the world, and bring greater peace and harmony among us all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judith, for being our guest, for being our guide, our teacher. And thank you all for attending today. I really encourage everyone to, I'm sure you have done this already, take a look at Judith's website. It's judithsimmer-brown.com. And on her homepage, she has a lovely quote by Howard Thurman, who I'm sure many of you know. Don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive and go do that. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. A beautiful quote. And I like your website. It's very nice.
I thought it was invisible. It's not finished yet. So thank you.
And I want to invite everyone in this series that Judith so kindly been an anchor of for us. 2 weeks from today, our guest will be Helen Tworkov, who was the founding editor of Tricycle Magazine. So that should be of interest to many of us. So, and with that, let's go ahead and close. Thank you all. Thank you, Judith.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Zen Peacemakers, for putting this together. And I hope that it will further empower and energize women in their leadership in their communities and in the larger world.